Good morning. Sorry, I missed breakfast this morning. Have you ever had lefse? Anybody ever had lefse? Has everybody had lefse? Has somebody not had lefse? I came across lefse this week. It is so good. It's like a mouthful of mashed potatoes. Oh, it's so good. For anyone who hasn't been with us for the last few weeks, it sounds a little hot, at least to me. Maybe it's monitors, but thank you very much. We're on week 4 of a series that we're calling Remember, in which we're looking at stories from the Old Testament, in which God steps into the lives of His people in such profound ways that they respond by building big towers of stones as a memorial to themselves and to generations to come of God's presence and His action. But before we jump in this morning, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Lord, you already have done such enormous great things in our own individual lives, in the lives of our families, and in the lives of this church. You've done so much that I'm hesitant to even ask you to do more. But I'm going to ask you to do more. This morning, as we open up your scriptures, as we open up our hearts, speak to us. Yes, as a church, but speak to us individually. Speak to me. Show me what you want me to see today. In your precious and holy name, we pray according to your character. Amen. You know, one of the reasons I love lefse so much is not just that it's just fantastic. I'm told that certain Minnesotan families have secret family lefse recipes. Seeing a lot of head shaking, but I'm told that in some families they even have their own family specialized pan for making lefse. And when they get together as a family, they'll gather the children around, and they'll make lefse with the secret family recipe. And that parents and grandparents will pass down that recipe, or that, as well as that process of making lefse and that family pan from generation to generation. Now, I don't know if that's a true story or not, but that's the way I heard it. And don't you tell me otherwise. No, I'm just kidding. No, I like this story because it reminds me of I like this idea because it reminds me of a custom in my own family. Growing up as a child in the Northcutt house, every time you walked into my grandmother's house, you were hit like a truck with the smell of freshly baked sourdough bread. A warm, delicious truck of freshly baked sourdough bread. And my grandmother, I don't know if you're familiar with making sourdough bread, there's a starter that is, I've never been very good at making bread, but it's yeast and some material for the yeast to eat so it stays alive. And that's involved in making the bread. Well, my grandmother got her starter when she was 18 from a woman who lived in her community in southern Missouri. And to the best of our ability to track it, when my grandmother passed a couple of years ago, it was 120 years old. It could possibly be older than that, but we were only able to trace it back about 120 years. And when she got it from the lady in her community, she passed it down to her 2 sons. And when Jess and I got married, she gave us some of that starter as well. And it was sort of always intended to be, we'll continue to make grandmother's bread. Unfortunately, Jess and I accidentally killed our starter. And my dad hasn't been in a bread-making mood for a couple of years. And so when my grandmother passed a couple of years ago, in all of the mourning and the logistics, we forgot that her starter was under her sink. And by the time anyone remembered, that starter had died. And so now, while no one will ever again be able to eat grandmother's sourdough bread, every time we eat sourdough bread at all, someone will say, "This is good, but it's not grandmother's bread. And while it's sort of a sad thought, reminding each other about her bread is also a way that we keep grandmother's memory alive. It has become something of a ritual in our family. What are the traditions built into your family life? What are the stories that you tell to the younger generations? What are the stories that they will tell their children, even though they weren't there for the original events? This question is something of a real problem for God's people throughout the Old Testament. See, when God showed up in the lives of his people, he showed up in big, huge ways. But in the grand scheme of things, particularly with time, he actually didn't show up very often. He doesn't even show up to every generation of his people in very clear, miraculous ways. And so for the Hebrews, or the Israelites as they came to be known, the rituals built into the Hebrew culture helped them to remember the great things that God had done. This is the context for our story this morning from Joshua chapter 4, actually beginning in chapter 3. If you've got a Bible, go ahead and begin to turn to Joshua chapter 3. If you don't, or would rather look at the screen, don't worry about it. The words will be on the screen. In the second book of the Bible, the book of Exodus, we find God working absolutely incredible works and miracles in the lives of his people in rescuing them from Egypt. And then God leads them to a mountain where he gives them the rituals and the procedures for interacting with him as the God of their people. In the book of Numbers, 2 books later, the 4th book of the Old Testament, we find God leading his people to the banks of the Jordan River, about to pass over and to take the land that God had promised to his descendants, or to Abraham, almost half a millennium earlier, and his people chicken out. Their faith isn't enough to follow God into that land, and so God decides this isn't the right generation to take the land. And so the rest of the book of Numbers, we find God leading his people, continuing to provide for them as he leads his people around the wilderness in preparation for them to die off, just literally waiting for them to die off. But once they do, once that generation dies off and the next generation comes to adulthood, God once again leads his people to the banks of the Jordan River. And in the book of Deuteronomy, we find God, through leaders like Moses and Joshua, reminding the people of the stories of their ancestors, of how God had worked in the lives of their ancestors. And then at the beginning of the book of Joshua, we find God leading his people across the Jordan River. Let's read from Joshua chapter 3, verses 14 through 17. So when the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant went ahead of them. Now the Jordan is at flood stage all during harvest. Yet as soon as the priests who carried the Ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a heap a great distance away at a town called Adam, in the vicinity of Zarethan, while the water flowing down to the Sea of Arabah, that is the Salt Sea, was completely cut off. So the people crossed over opposite Jericho. The priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stopped in the middle of the Jordan and stood on dry ground, while all Israel passed by until the whole nation had completed the crossing on dry ground. Now, when God parted the Red Sea for their ancestors, back in the book of Exodus, the Red Sea was a huge deep body of water. And so when God parted the Red Sea, you had 2 big walls of water, at least seemingly. But the Jordan River was a very different type of body of water than the Red Sea. The Jordan River, for most of the year, is between 3 and 10 feet deep. It's really shallow compared to other bodies and other seas, but it's about 100 feet wide. And for those of us used to canoeing or hiking, we know that even 3 feet of water moving at any kind of pace can be pretty treacherous when you try to ford it. And so for the Hebrews to try to get across this river at any time of the year with elderly and children and animals, it just would have been difficult. But verse 15 tells us that the river was in its flood stages. It had overflowed its banks, meaning that it would have been deeper and wider. And yet when those leading the people had just barely stepped their feet into the water's edge, at that moment the water of the Jordan River stopped flowing, but it didn't stop right there. It stopped 20 miles north near the village of Adam. 20 miles north. For the Hebrews there at that moment, it would have been as if when the priests stepped their feet into the waters of the edge of the water, it would have been as if the river just began to recede. Just began to recede until there was no water. No water down river, no water up river, at least as far as they could see. The river was just gone. And that alone really should have been enough for those Hebrews to remember for the rest of their lives, to remember God's provision for them on that day, to remember God's protection from the rushing rapids. But the problem was that generation would eventually get old and die. That generation, just like the generation before, wouldn't last forever. Would God need to show up in the lives of the next generation in the same way as this one and those before? Would God need to work miracles in the lives of every generation from this point forward? Let's read again, this time from Joshua chapter 4, verses 1 through 9. When the whole nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, "Choose 12 men from among the people, one from each tribe, and tell them to take up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, from right where the priests are standing, and carry them over with you and put them down at the place where you stay tonight." So Joshua called together the 12 men he had appointed from the Israelites, one from each tribe, and said to them, "Go over before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, to serve as a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask you, 'What do those stones mean?' I want to say that again. In the future, when your children ask you, 'What do these stones mean?' tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever." So the Israelites did as Joshua commanded them. They took 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, as the Lord had told Joshua, and they carried them over with them to their camp, where they put them down. Joshua set up 12 stones in the midst of the Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant had stood, and they are there to this day. God didn't just want his actions in the Hebrews' lives to draw them. He wanted his actions on this day to point his people back to him forever, generation after generation after generation. And so God tells Joshua to pick a man from each family or tribe within this nation and to have them go to where the priests were standing in the middle of the river with the Ark of the Covenant on their shoulders. For those who are less familiar with this, God had given them on the mountain, following that time, what we call the Ark of the Covenant. And he had instructed them to build this box covered in gold with places to put poles through so that they could carry it without touching it. The Ark of the Covenant had various pieces of their history that were intricately tied to God inside of it. And as the people moved throughout the wilderness, the ark was the symbol of God's presence. It was the place where God dwelt among his people. And there's tons and tons of stories surrounding the holiness or the set-apartness of this Ark of the Covenant. But on this day, the ark, God's presence led his people across the Jordan River. And it was when the priests carrying that ark stepped into the water's edge, at that moment that the waters began to recede. And then the priests go and they stand in the middle of the Jordan River as the people pass by them. As if God, not as if, as a symbol, an illustration of God being the one that was making it able for them to cross. And God told Joshua to go to exactly where those priests were standing in the midst of that river and to take stones and to carry those stones on their shoulders, big, large stones, carry those stones on their shoulders to the place where they would camp that night, a place that came to be known as Gilgal. And they were to set those stones up as a reminder of what God had done on this day. In fact, the name Gilgal literally means circle of stones. Kind of cool. And again, this on its own, even if this was where the story ended, this on its own would be enough, because we see God thinking forward. We see God not only concerned with the people who experience this, but concerned with their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren, and the ability to pass by this encampment at Gilgal, this village of Gilgal, and to see the circle of stones, and for them to be able to point to that and say, hey, see those circle of stones? Let me tell you the story behind those circle of stones. But to me, I think what we see in verse 9 is maybe even just as significant. And Joshua set up 12 stones in the midst of the Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant had stood, and they are there to this day. We see Joshua going beyond God's instruction to them. Notice that. Did God ever tell Joshua to take 12 stones and put them into the river where the priests were standing? The answer is no. That instruction is never there. Joshua absolutely instructs the Israelites to follow God's command to the letter, but he also takes another step in his own initiative. He sees an opportunity to create another opportunity for remembrance. See, the Jordan River, for most of the year, is going to be between 3 and 10 feet. And any of you who are, canoers or kayakers know that as you go down a river, there are just little places where the water just runs over big boulders or big sections of rock in the underbed. And you never really see the rocks. They're not tall enough. But what they are tall enough to do is to make the water, as it comes over them, it just makes a little ripple, or depending on the size of the stone, a pile of stones, or a big ripple in the water. And what Joshua created, he knew that for a few months out of each year, God's people would be able, as they passed the Jordan River, as they came to the Jordan River to feed their animals and to get water, they would be able to see that ripple in the water there in the midst of the Jordan River. And they would be able to say to their children, do you see that ripple? See that one right there? That was where the priest stood on the day that our people crossed into safety, into the land that God provided and promised to our fathers, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. What is it that you want your children and your grandchildren to receive from you? Really. What is it that you want to pass on? What values do you want them to pick up from you? What stories do you want them to tell their children and grandchildren? For several years, I served as a youth pastor in a church in Mississippi, about the same more or less size as Lifepoint. And in my youth group, I had several sets of parents that I knew had real, deep, sincere relationship with Jesus. I knew that because they were in my Sunday school class. And every week, or not every week, but I would hear them telling stories of the circumstances that they were going through and how their trust in Jesus sustained them and how their relationship with Jesus was enough to get them through the circumstances in their lives. I knew that. And yet, as deep and sincere and real as these parents' relationship with Jesus was, their children didn't know Jesus from the man in the moon. Now, can I really make that judgment? No, I can't really make that judgment, but they were in my youth group, and I interacted with them, and I saw them on social media, and I saw them interacting with their peers, and if they had a relationship with Jesus at all, it was very shallow, and it was very surface level. And for years, I wondered, how do you have parents with real, sincere, deep relationships with Jesus that doesn't rub off on their kids? I mean, other things rubbed off. Their valuing of academics, that rubbed off. Their valuing of Ole Miss football, that definitely rubbed off. But their relationship with Jesus, the sincerity of their walk with Jesus, it didn't. Now, these students went to church every week. They knew the Bible stories. They knew right from wrong. They even knew the right answers to the Jesus questions. They just didn't have much depth in their own personal relationship. And then one day, it occurred to me, unlike the value of a good education and unlike the value of the wonders of a good football game, these parents had never brought their children into their relationship with Jesus. These parents' walk with Jesus was deep, and it was sincere, and it was real, but it was private. It was acted out in their own personal lives. They had never told their children the stories of how God had rescued them even when they had made really terrible choices, or how God had brought encouragement to them when they were discouraged, or how God had shown them grace when they needed grace. Now, they absolutely had talked to their children about doing right and avoiding wrong, and so their children were halfway decent members of society. And they talked to their children about the importance of going to church. And so even when these kids got old enough that they could drive and they had a little bit more freedom, they would still get ready and go to church in the morning. But they'd never told their children the stories of God interacting in their life. And because they hadn't told those stories, their children didn't have those stories to fall back upon when they needed to be rescued, or when they needed encouragement, or when they needed grace. Let me ask you again, what is it that you want your children and your grandchildren to receive from you? Maybe not your children. Maybe those you teach in Sunday school. Maybe those you lead on Wednesday night. Maybe your neighbors. Maybe those in your Boy Scout troop. Those that surround you in your life. Maybe your students in school. What do you want them to get? What do you want to rub off from them being around you? What values do you want them to pick up from you? What stories do you want them to tell their children and grandchildren? In just a moment, our musicians are going to come up, and they're going to lead us in one more song of worship. And as they do, ask yourself this question: how has God shown up in your life in ways that are actually worth remembering? What has God done that's worth remembering? And then secondly, ask this. What opportunities might there be for you to set up pillars of stones in your own life or in your own family life to help remember to tell those stories? Lord, thank you for the stories that you give us in your scriptures, the stories that you give us in our own lives. Speak to us this morning.